Some dare call it conspiracy.
Welcome to Some Dare Call It Conspiracy with Brent Lee and Neil Sanders. Today, we are joined by Barrett Brown, a journalist and activist known for his fearless investigations into government and corporate misconduct. Barrett is the founder of Project PM, a platform for analyzing leaked intelligence. Despite facing serious legal challenges, including a lengthy prison sentence, he continues to advocate for transparency and accountability. Join us as we discuss his tumultuous journey and the evolving landscape of modern activism.
Yeah, we were very interested by your response to our email. So you were aware of the Gary Allen book, Some Dare Call It Conspiracy?
Yeah, so I owned that when I was about 13 years old, bought it at a library sale in Dallas. Dallas, of course, is, as you may know, is a center of a lot of things. One of them is far right-wing ideology and so forth. So it makes sense that I would have found a copy of that. All I remember of it is a lot of talk about the Korean War and the ways in which some dubious concerns about why it had gone the way it had and so forth. But I know I've always been interested in fringe, viewpoints, so forth, especially more recently, because that has fringe viewpoints as they exist now play a very keen factor in what we do and do not investigate as a society, as the press, so forth. And that's something the intelligence community, at least on occasion, they're aware of that dynamic as well. And so it becomes a fun way to ensure that certain operations don't get real scrutiny from, let's say, middling reporters.
Well, I mean, we're skipping slightly ahead here, but we were just saying before we came on air that the demographics of this conspiracy crowd, the gamer crowd, your 4chan crowd, when you've got systems like Cambridge Analytica, which we very much want to talk to you about, you've got a captive audience there. You've got someone that you can study. You've got parameters of a group, things that allow and disallow for inclusion of that group. And in many ways, these sort of communities are sort of ripe for manipulation. I'm sure you're aware of this. The John Birch Society, which is obviously where non-dare call it conspiracy came from, there's sort of vague connection to Cambridge Analytica through people like Joseph Coors and the Fred Koch, who founded the Heritage Foundation and latterly the CNP, Billy Graham and William Falwell and that type of ideology. It was the Mercers and Kellyanne Conway, Mike Pence, Michael Flynn were all members of the Council for National Policy, and that pervasive ideology was very, very tied in, which is bizarre because, essentially the concern of the John Birch Society was that there was going to be a world communist takeover, and that essentially, if you want to be very cynical, that seems to be a justification for certain fascist and racist attitudes. So that's where this sort of connection is. But the thing that's always fascinated me about your work, Barrett, is the sort of understanding that it's not just data mining. It's this sort of interplay between supposedly private contractors and the intelligence agency using this data in order to alter behavior.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of what you were getting at with these fringe groups. Because to my mind, these groups have been attacked and their behavior has been changed by these programs. And this is essentially why we got the rise of Trump and Brexit. And to use a sort of horribly overused term at the minute, the Overton window is shifted to the point where things that a few years ago were abhorrent to most people are now become essential sort of tools in the culture war.
Yeah. So, and that's what we said earlier. That is one of the reasons why it's unfortunate that surveillance in and of itself was the key takeaway back in 2013 after Snowden, when I was still in prison at that point, because the responses to that, like among Thomas Friedman, who's a big New York Times columnist, the general response to that by middling, sort of mediocre commentators is that, I'm not doing anything, worrisome, and most people aren't. So what's the issue? And of course, even in the sense of surveillance, there are responses to that argument, such as there is a portion of society at any given point that is engaged in activities that are effective in terms of exposing malfeasance, corruption, and they are the targets for it. They're not Thomas Friedman, not people who get along well with the establishment. But beyond that, as you said, the real money, the real power that has emerged in the last 25 years out of these government-funded projects and under the direct oversight of GCHQ, CIA, In-Q-Tel, which is CIA's investment arm, Palantir, all the products of all this, is an apparatus that has done an extraordinary job of taking all this massive amount of information that's useless on its own, given how massive it is, figuring out how to utilize it to change opinions, to make predictions on a mass scale in a way that affects everyone. Depending on how far you got in the book, you may have come across the point where I was running for Al Jazeera and had an article about a program under CENTCOM that we had discovered. And this editor at Al Jazeera, who they brought on from CBS, is CBS radio producer, which if you're familiar with American media culture, it's going to be he's going to say something stupid. And in this case, this guy asked me to find victims of data mining and to get their stories, to get a human touch. And I had to explain to him that data mining is not that kind of thing. You don't know what's happened. It's on a large scale. Anyway, then they ghosted me because it turns out the program was something that Qatar, which owns Al Jazeera, was on board with, presumably because it's directed at its enemies. Anyway, so that's a key misunderstanding that exists as to what it is that we're worried about, what it is that Peter Thiel, NSA, CIA, all the organizations that are inevitably captured to some extent by bad actors, what it is that they're really doing that is manifested several times with Brexit, 2016 election in the U.S., so on. And again, it's just information, it's manipulation, it's the ability to not just have a technology that does tremendous things, but to do so in a way that has thus far been beyond the ability of the press to understand it, to track it, and to give it the attention it clearly deserves. That's tremendous power. It's one thing to have an army. It's one thing to have a surveillance network, disinformation network. It's another thing altogether to be in a situation in which it doesn't matter what we expose, what gets leaked out, what we catch them doing. They're focused less on preventing leaks than they are in making sure that leaks don't matter. And they've been very successful in making sure that leaks and everything else can cease to matter to the extent that they need them to. And that's the real tragedy that we're facing here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people it sounds like that editor sort of understood it on the level of identity theft or stealing your credit card number or something like that. When
absolutely, yes.
Well, it's not. It's. I mean, it says it on the tin, so to speak. It's data-driven behavior change, and it's been employed in numerous ways that have. Bizarrely, what was strange was that we saw it. There was obviously people ignoring it in the mainstream. Or covering it to a degree and no further. Obviously, what did you think to the documentary The Great Hack?
Oh, I haven't seen that. Surprisingly, I'm actually not very conversant with a lot of the basic media around a lot of these issues for a couple of reasons. One of which I was in prison during a part of it, had to catch up when I got out. Another is that to some degree it's personal for me, and I have difficulties, watching or reading anything else beyond what I've already done about these issues. Like I haven't even seen Mr. Robot, and it's fairly partly based on me because I just can't.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm actually know less about some of these basics than any keen observer like yourself.
What do you think about Peter Thiel then? Let's just jump straight into Peter Thiel and his influence on society.
Sure. So Peter Thiel had a lot going for him. Number one, he was German. He got in very early with the intelligence community and the arm of the intelligence community that was overseeing software, overseeing sort of the efforts of the CIA to make sure that however the information age, went down, that they were able to do what they felt they needed to do within those perimeters. As such, Facebook, which he was on the board on from early on, Palantir is one of his first and most dangerous firms, and a few other of his outfits got money from In-Q-Tel, the CIA's investment arm. There's also Sequoia Capital, which is even a less official version of In-Q-Tel anyway. And so he was very well positioned in 2010, 2011 to be getting contracts from the DOJ and from Bank of America and U.S. Chamber of Commerce to engage in the kinds of things that the FBI likes to engage in whenever they're allowed to do so, which they usually are. And that is tamping down on labor unions, leftists, very vanilla, very mainstream groups like Code Pink, Stop the Chamber, again, union leaders. And so they had the technology and they had the sociopathy in terms of their human resources to make that work, to have people who would spy on the children of labor union leaders, find out what Jewish synagogue they go to, try to find, they got dirt on them, and openly talk about how they could do that so as to better accomplish the mission, which was to discredit these organizations. It was a bizarre twist of fate that because one of the participants, Aaron Barr, an ex-Navy intelligence fellow who ran his own company, because he decided to go to the Financial Times and brag about his infiltration of our operations while we were helping the Tunisian Revolution, it's only for that reason that several of our hackers went the next day and took all of his emails from HB Gary Federal, which was involved in this larger plot with Palantir, In-Game Systems, and Barrico, allowing us to stumble upon several disturbing things that even Congress started to investigate. Democratic members of Congress, mostly Black caucus members. And of course, the DOJ under Obama found common cause of Republicans in Congress, and they both coordinated to make sure that no investigation actually took place, which was, for the best since they'd already been caught, the DOJ, putting this thing in motion to begin with. And then they were caught doing several other related things in the next few months. But by that time, the FBI was had already created its strategy for imprisoning and discrediting those of us who they identified as the ringleaders of this campaign. So, despite the fact that the New York Times, even the New York Times ran an article a few weeks later summarizing our findings, that didn't stop the New York Times 3 years after that from running an article contradicting that, providing a very vanilla and again, false, like demonstrably false version of what happened, what we exposed, with an article written by someone who a few months later then went on to work for Google at a much higher rate of salary. So this is the kind of thing we're dealing with. We're dealing with a situation in which there are no mechanisms in the U.S. anymore at all, and there never really were that many to begin with, to prevent just demonstrable malfeasance about the most important issues on the part of its staffers and editors. They protect each other, just like cops, exactly like cops, and sometimes for the same reasons. So he had an advantage going forward. So then when they were caught again in 2016, when Palantir came up in the Cambridge Analytica thing, and once again, New York Times eventually, that someone came to them with the evidence and they ran it. And the same excuse that Palantir used the first time in 2011, which was that their involvement in the Cambridge Analytica efforts was the sole responsibility of a single staffer who was just overzealous and no one knew about it. The same response they put out in 2011, which had been discredited within a couple of days and then more so later on, they used, and it worked. They understand how the media works. They understand how individual reporters work, how editors work, how they think. They know that time passes very quickly. Stories are only stories when they're new. Stories are really only stories when someone can benefit from them career-wise. Beyond that, it becomes the province, people like me who, have a death wish or whatever, and, they kind of get lost in the fog. So naturally, in the last 14 years, he has gone from someone with a minor but significant, still relatively significant role in the intelligence community and in the corporate, let's call it the kleptocracy, to someone who has been able to decide on presidential candidates in the GOP. A couple of days ago, decide on the VP candidate, one of his former employees, J.D. Vance, who worked at Mithril Capital. Mithril, like all of his firms, named after some Lord of the Rings shit. He's gotten to that point. He's gotten to the point where his firm, Palantir, among other things, runs the NHS data now. He's got a firm, Enduro, that creates drones for tracking migrants. At the same time, his other firm now runs the UN's database on people's, migrant peoples who are vulnerable, classified as vulnerable to abuse and to so forth. All of this has happened because the press, to the extent the press was capable and willing to do the important work in front of it, that has changed significantly in the last 20 years, partly organically, just because the same reason everything's fallen apart. Also because people like Peter Thiel has been able to buy or blackmail in a few cases, prominent opinion makers. So, yeah, this is it was inevitable that he would get to this point where he's this powerful, and wherein his connections, his overt connections and employment of active Nazi ringleaders, like Andrew Arnheimer, who issued Clearview AI, and then his former lawyer, Tor Eklund. It's gotten to the point where that can just happen. And we never reach a threshold at which someone says, hey, this is kind of disturbing and perhaps worthy of some sustained attention. We just never reach that point. That should give you an indication of how bad things are across the board. So Thiel is not responsible for everything that's happened in the last 15 years, but he's a great indicator of why it happens. And he's responsible, I would say, for more of it than any other single person, with the exception of Gilman Louis, who's a much lesser known CIA figure. Anyway, that's another story.
No, please do. Tell us about Gilman Louis.
Oh, well, Gilman Louis. So it's an interesting story. Gilman Louis, a genius by all accounts, got involved with the U.S. intelligence community in the early 80s on the software end. And one of his main gigs was representing or buying or creating software, games, in fact, flight simulators and so forth. He was the one who licensed Tetris from the Russians back in the 80s. He is also the head of In-Q-Tel, or he was for a while. He's the recipient of the CIA's highest known honor, award medal. And he is the person who is essentially the architect of all of this, in so much as that he is Peter Thiel's. He's the person who's given Peter Thiel the most potential energy by which to achieve his fascist objectives. He's very little known. His name is not even known among national security reporters, tech reporters. Very, very niche person. The only reason I know about him is through some ex-intelligence people that pointed us in that direction back in 2011 when sort of things were at their peak. He's also involved, has a history with Colonel Alexander, the fellow, if you've seen the film, Men Who Stare at Goats.
Yeah.
And SIIC, the firms that do some really esoteric things, for better or worse, he's involved in that world. And that in itself might perhaps explain some of the odder notions that we see expressed by not just Thiel, but Eric Weinstein, I think his name is, the guy who ran one of Thiel's other capital firms, and he goes on Joe Rogan all the time. There's a confluence basically at the top there of some very colorful legacies of the intelligence community, of the Cold War, and so forth. Having said that, that's all I know about Gilman Louis. There's not much to find,
It's quite interesting because we're investigating that sort of Stargate Men Who Stare at Goats thing at the minute, and the entire story started when a man decided that his chinchilla was psychic, and following on from that led to a man who decided that he wanted to hook yogurt up to a lie detector machine. Following these experiments, the CIA threw $30 million at it. So it just goes to show you.
Yeah, I mean, and that in itself is sort of overlaps to this larger issue in so much as that regardless of what we think about these things, they are taken very, very seriously by a number of individuals ranging from Democratic Minority Leader Chuck Schumer to, a lot of ex-diplomats, intelligence communities. So it's quite possible that there has been a successful effort to disseminate these things in a convincing way among both far right, far left, moderate people with access to intelligence who are briefed. And there's no telling what the motive of that is, at least from the outside. Even I would not even, I'm pretty arrogant. Even I would not rise to speculate on what's going on there. I know from experience how difficult it is to really get a sense of these kinds of issues when there's a lot of interest involved. It's got like a squid spraying ink around itself. It's not a viable investigation, line of inquiry. But it's interesting, and it may end up being the case in the next few years that we learn more about that, and more about why some of these very powerful people with access to the world's most expensive intelligence programs, why they have been convinced of some of these notions. I think we'll probably the way things are going, I think in the next few years, we will get a sense of how that happened. Not why, but how.
So just to explain to our listeners, why do the intelligence agencies use these private contractors? And what do these private contractors explain to the public that they're supposed to be doing as opposed to what they're actually doing?
So the answer to the first question is, it started out, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, the U.S. in particular, somewhat in contrast to the U.K., we're very keen on competition as a means of developing the best possible procedures. And so that doctrine was applied to the intelligence community, mostly starting after 9/11. We've had powerful private interests like Lockheed Martin and so forth involved at the highest echelons of secret programs, for forever. But the proliferation of these firms, especially ones dealing in information operations, was really a phenomenon of the post 9/11 world. That's when a lot of these firms based in Virginia or California, mostly Virginia, rose up. There was a lot of money to be made, both by competent people with new ideas on how to confuse, how to infiltrate, so forth, as well as hucksters who really weren't bringing things to the table, but they could get it. It's not hard to get a contract with a general who doesn't know, who doesn't care if the money's being wasted. So there was a huge opportunity for a lot of people, very colorful people, again, to get into this industry. And take the things they had learned in the intelligence community, take these skills and apply them in a way that would make them tremendous amounts of money, and also, in some cases, pursue their existing far-right ideologies. The FBI, as you may know, has very rarely been effective in going after far-right groups. They've been very public about the efforts they did make with the KKK in the 80s, but for the most part, and up until today, they're generally preoccupied with blacks, left-wing anarchists, journalists, and so forth. And which leads me to your second question: what are they telling the public? How are they going about their business with these things exposed? The answer is it doesn't matter. This is part of the larger issue where no information really matters. There's been a harmonization. There's been a diversity of sources, which is good in some ways and also bad in others, wherein, anyone, not just the crazy people, as you might think on the internet, but mainstream reporters and so forth, are never fully confronted with any fact that they might find contrary to that they might find to be a source of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
And in fact, there are career reasons not to pursue certain lines of inquiry, especially because certain lines of inquiry become associated with outlandish, conspiracy people like Alex Jones.
Yeah.
Whether or not those are things that regardless of their actual validity, once they become associated with Jones, and once, for instance, let's say a military contracting company can say that, then they can easily get a reporter to write, there's these conspiracy theories around about this thing, Alex Jones or whoever says it. From that point on, it is essentially, it's got a sort of chastity belt around the story. You can't fuck it anymore. And that right there is enough to prevent 99.5% of working U.S. media people who are job insecure, who in many cases, just like comedians, tend to be perhaps neurotic, perhaps not very self-assertive, very naive. That's enough. That's enough right there. And it doesn't matter if occasionally some really disturbing things come out that perhaps contradict what we might know already, what we all might think we know about the world. It doesn't matter. There's a million ways to get around that. So we're in an area in which it's no longer necessary to keep information secret as such. All that's necessary is to, really nothing is necessary. We're already in an ecosystem in which everything is suspect, even things that come along with convincing proof and have people, prominent, respected journalists who are down dead, or activists like Aaron Schwartz, Michael Hastings, the things that they investigated and found and the things that officers carried on, they just don't matter. There's all we can really do is find a very slim constituency of people who, unlike the vast majority of Westerners in the post-World War II world, will perhaps at some day act if there's a more overt fascist takeover. That's all we can do. We can't really aspire to, get breaking news story on CNN about anything.
There seems to be like a sort of almost bizarre sort of reluctance on the part of the mainstream media to just acknowledge that there is actually a rise of the far right, and it's getting to the point where it is actually looking kind of dangerous. And a lot of that has been achieved, we think, by the sort of Cambridge Analytica stuff. Like you've got people like, say, your Ben Shapiro and stuff who are financed by Wilkes Brothers and stuff like that. You've got your Dave Rubins and people like that, and your Stephen Crowders who are taking money from Kochs. Breitbart, obviously. You mentioned Weave, him and I think it was Andrew Anglin were caught sort of writing stories for the Daily Caller and for Breitbart and Milo Yiannopoulos. So this is the thing, it's multifaceted, isn't it, the disinformation. You've also got a political level of it as well. Trump, obviously, the sort of advocates of that. We're starting to see the rise of more of that type of character in the UK. Boris Johnson to an extent, certainly Nigel Farage.
You're also importing some U.S. figures. Andy Ngo, for instance, who is a major figure, he has been spending more and more time in the U.K. Working closely with for instance, the Metropolitan Police Union, as well as other Peter Thiel proteges like himself. And again, he was the official designated informant, quote unquote. In my case, when I was arrested in 2021, a few months before that's in it. At the same time, so that's a great case study. A few years ago, Andy Ngo, and then this is actually sort of the answer to a larger question of why are so many outlets having a hard time acknowledging these people are Nazis and that they're doing Nazi things and so forth, and that it matters. One of the reasons is that there's a sort of a doctrine that's increasingly understood and practiced among people who have access to some of the more active intelligence and police outfits out there. That doctrine is that if you can approach a reporter under some pretense and get them to publish what they think is a scoop, and it turns out to be not only incorrect, but extremely incorrect to an extent that they're potentially now prone to public embarrassment, at that point, you can ensure in again, 99.99% of cases, unfortunately, that they are not going to complain. They're not going to call you out for burning them. To the extent that they do become aware that what they put out is not just incorrect, but is something that, let's say, the FBI or In-Q-Tel or in-game systems or dozens of outfits wanted them to put out, what they're going to do, unfortunately, in nearly every case, is they're going to avoid any opportunity to come clean about this. And in some cases, they're going to act like someone with their back up against the wall. They're going to lash out at the people that were perhaps victimized by the disinformation they put out. There's this, just like with business, just like with corporations, military, police, journalism and activism attracts several kinds of people. Some are eccentric nobles, quixotic, adventurers, some are, whatever, people working out their own issues. I'm a combination of those two. Some of them are, just want something to do. There's also sociopaths and even the worst things. And they, again, just like with corporations and police, these kind of people prosper. And so it's a great ecosystem in which they have the advantage. And even people who are decent when they can be, which is, I think, the bulk of the modern Western world, it's not difficult at all to create an environment in which most of them have an interest, have a stake in a particular storyline not being resolved, not being corrected. And so that alone is enough. There are other doctrines, there are other procedures, as you would expect from a industry, a sector in the intelligence community, marketing, so forth, that has had a long time and a lot of money and resources by which to study these things. It has brought in psychologists, stage magicians, all kind. A sector that, it really is a credit to the UK and America, insofar as that during World War II, our intelligence sector was very creative, very ballsy, willing to accomplish extremely bizarre, methods by which to trick the Nazis, by which to win the war. Unfortunately, that same energy and some of that same doctrine carried over to this subsequent time in which governments, peoples have not been quite as useful to the world at large. Yeah. And of course, beyond that, they've trickled down to these private firms. And to every single, sort of fuzzy-headed, right-wing warlock software engineer with a security clearance. They all have access to things that no one should have access to. And they can get caught. It doesn't matter. The only people who suffer the consequences are those of us who have the bad fortune of catching them.
That's brilliant. So, what do you think is Elon Musk's role in this? Because it suddenly struck us that basically, like, all the disinformation, your captive audience, your astroturf and your sock puppet accounts. Twitter is essentially just, is rife with that. And Elon himself has spread stuff to do with great replacement theory and far-right nonsense, anti-trans stuff. And of course, he going to start with Peter Thiel. He's made overtures towards Peter Thiel recently. He's decided to publicly finance the Trump campaign. What's going on with that?
So Elon Musk, Pierre Omidyar, and Peter Thiel go way back.
Yes,
to their origins and all that. I knew almost nothing about Elon Musk until I got out of prison. Actually, he was not back in 2012. He was not a figure that we came across or thought much of. Based on what I can determine, or what I can be reasonably sort of hypothesize, Elon Musk is not quite the brains behind the operation. He is someone that Peter Thiel, that takes Peter Thiel's direction. Which if I was Elon Musk, and I guess I'm not, I guess I would probably defer to Peter Thiel myself. But as far as we can tell, based on the things that we have access to, the decision to buy Twitter, that was something that it was not Elon Musk's idea, put it that way. Pierre Omidyar's decision to, a few years after he was publicly calling whistleblowers traitors and calling for them to be prosecuted, the fact that he in 2014 put up $500 million to buy access to the Snowden archive and buy Greenwald, something he did with the participation of Weave and Peter Thiel, that was not Pierre Omidyar's idea, most likely. That was someone else's, and probably Peter Thiel was involved in that. Remember, it was only a year ago that Peter Thiel's status as a longtime FBI asset was made public by Charles Johnson, the supposed anti-Semite figure who's kind of popped up in some of these things. Incidentally, Charles Johnson, his anti-Semitism may be an act. I'm not sure of it, but to me, he does not seem convincing. I think there are reasons to create a persona, a silly persona, a crazy persona, such that you're less likely to be regarded seriously by a certain kind of journalist. Louise Mensch does the same thing. That's another story I'd be happy to go into. But anyway, so Elon Musk he's at the table. He's got money. He comes from a South African diamond smuggling family, and that he's what in prison they would call a good white dude. So he gets to sit at the table. And he's not he's a white supremacist, but he's got money. So he has status. So I think to the extent that his public persona, as we see on Twitter and so forth, to the extent that really is the result of what it seems to be, which is him being a ketamine practitioner and who takes Adderall and so forth, and is just perhaps autistic in that particularly sociopathic way. That's really him, presumably. And if that really is his personality, then definitely he is playing second banana to Peter Thiel and to other individuals that Peter Thiel works with within the intelligence community and outside of it, like General Flynn. So his role is very prominent. His role is very front-facing. That may have, I don't know if that's by design, but it definitely, I'm sure the effect objectively has kind of been to make the PayPal mafia, as they call themselves, look kind of silly, inept, a figure of fun, which they are to some extent. But so was Hitler after the beer hall push, and for much later on after that.
Oh, that's interesting. Oh, right. Okay. So like, the Elon Musk is there to just, to soften their image. Like, yeah.
I actually don't think that's the case. I'm just saying that is the kind of thing we do. Like, we have to look at a lot of scenarios in these things when we evaluate them based on what's come out publicly about different operations. So we have to look and say, are they doing this thing again? Like, are they, this report they did on how you go about this, is that what they're doing? I actually don't think that's the case. I think Elon Musk is kind of like me in my own way. I think he's kind of a loose cannon who is a creature of impulse, of ego, of a need to seem in control and so forth. I think it's actually him. But what I'm just saying is that in general, we always have to kind of
consider the options.
Absolutely. We have to consider perhaps more involved, more Baroque scenarios that might seem a little outlandish, simply because we're dealing with the CIA. You have no choice but to do that.
No, fair play. You mentioned Louise Mensch. Please go on, because she's somewhat dropped off. Like, she was quite a British politician, made some noise. Like I seem to remember, like right at the beginning, she sort of made some overtures of being sort of a bit sort of right on and whatnot, like a bit of a sort of activist or whatnot. So what were you going to say about her?
She's very similar in some ways to Aaron Barr, to Sabo, Hector Massador from that anonymous. Similar to Emma Best, the Army counterintelligence officer that was and Wikistrat employee who later on masqueraded as an activist for a number of years. All these people who sort of come into the community, gain capital, and then gradually they're determined to be, what they are. She's very much like that. So she was a Tory MP. She was best known, I think, here in the UK back then for saying how much ecstasy and coke she had done back in the days and how it fried her brain, which is a hell of a legacy, a real tribute to, I'm sure Cromwell wishes he'd come back and just take over Parliament again. And then right before the U.S. really kicked off, by the time I got out of prison, when the election just happened and the Democrats were about to start contending with the possibility that there had been serious intelligence operations, involved in the Trump's election. She had some meetings that were photographed with Eric Prince and a few other members of the far right who were heavily involved. Well, he seemed to be with Flynn, Russian intelligence, some of the Duginist, authoritarian figures that have persuaded, that sort of gotten a lot of converts in the West in the last 10 years. She was involved with them very closely. That's not something, obviously, that she has been willing to address or explain. Anyway, shortly after that, she emerges in the U.S. press, on CNN and so forth, as an expert on Russia. And she starts saying some things that seem plausible about Russian intelligence capabilities and what they can do, what they probably did. And then, by the time I got out, I remember this. So by this time, she was starting to say things that seemed quite outlandish, and in some cases were. And as a result of that, as a result of her partial capture of the movements to investigate Russian interference and to investigate interference in the election altogether on the Trump part. Because remember, the Mueller Commission wasn't just about Russian interference; it was about any interference whatsoever. Which is why they briefly investigated some of the firms that Mueller had actually protected under Flynn years prior, before forgetting them altogether. So her objective effect was to provide a lot of ammo for those who, for whatever reason, were opposed to the idea that Russia might have done something untoward in an election in a foreign country. They gave a lot of ammunition to the idea that everyone was crazy who believed that, who was looking at that. One of the great examples is the New Republic, one of our oldest in the U.S., one of our oldest, most prestigious left-wing magazines. It got its start in World War I, convincing Americans to go fight World War I. Great legacy. They ran an article back in early 2017 making fun of, and in fact, castigating Democrats who were calling for an inquiry into Russia's involvement, calling them conspiracy theorists, saying this was deranged, outlandish. Person I know, Leah McAlrath, who at the time was the communications director for a Texas Democratic congressional candidate, had to resign as a result of this article. Again, this was a few months before the press at large decided that this was not just not crazy, but in fact, the most likely scenario. So what I'm saying is that based on that and the direct interactions I've had with Louise Mensch, which have ranged from her getting in touch with me privately and publicly calling me a Russian agent, and then privately saying, I think you're a real U.S. patriot. And then later on, calling for me to be questioned in the disappearance of Val Broeksmit, the FBI informant who was later found dead. There's no doubt in my mind that she is the opposite of what she portrayed herself as early on. She is someone who was put in there to act crazy, discredit the investigations into whatever Russian involvement there was in the election. And I do think there was some. I don't know how effective it was. And that's also the opinion of a lot of people who used to work for her in different capacities, who booked her on different stations, and who sort of watch potential intelligence assets closely for professional reasons. That's pretty much the doctrine now. It's another great example of someone who, if you ask even pretty intelligent, pretty savvy reporters, like, oh, she's crazy, you don't even think about her. That is, if that were the case, that'd be great. We wouldn't have to worry about her anymore. There's a crazy person who briefly managed to convince the most powerful nation in the world to give her attention on the most relevant subject. I mean, that would be one thing, but that's just not what it is. It's something that, unfortunately, it's one of those things that we can demonstrate. We're all convinced of it. There's just not a whole lot of nothing to be gained from going to the press and saying, "Hey, you're all conned by the far right." And that's really what this is really what this all boils down to. It just boils down to careerism, embarrassment, de facto blackmail, in the sense that someone who is conned by this, books them for an interview, whatever, doesn't want to revisit the issue. It's the same thing over again.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. But it is strange though, because it's almost as if it's sort of self-insulated. You cannot to reveal all the sort of disinformation that's happened is to essentially call the audience rubes or whatever.
Exactly, and there's nothing. I mean, all the sacrifices the last 20 years, last 30 years that the U.S. talks about how we're ready to sacrifice this. This is a big part of our ethos. We're very big into the soldier, the revolutionary, so forth. Freedom isn't free. When it actually comes down to admitting an error that might potentially make us feel bad about ourselves, might destroy our sense of ourselves, might hurt our career, might make others laugh at us, there is, again, and this is not an exaggeration, I wish it was, there is almost no one, even including people who are very prominent and respected in the transparency community, whistleblowers, there is almost no one who is not vulnerable to that method. The method of associating someone with an error.
Yeah, blotting their copybook forever, essentially. Yeah,
it's human nature is basically is something that it's something you can study over 100 years, and something you can create doctrine on. It's something you can manipulate, and that's something that is really hard for a lot of people to acknowledge, even though it's quite obvious and clear. And yeah. So that's what it boils down to. If we were all robots, if we were a sort of a sentient AI with no egos and all that, this would all be sorted out in 10 minutes.
Well, Elon's on it, so that might happen. So, but so the Russia thing, I don't know whether you'd agree with me, but I think we're on the same page in as much as I think there was some, but I think that the Russian collusion, once we're having that conversation, we're not even looking at Cambridge Analytica, Palantir, anything like that.
Exactly. So at that 2016, at that point, that was sort of the degree to which the U.S. public had basically gone psychotic over the last few years. And I was lucky enough to be in prison during this time. So, I was confused when I got out, but again, I feel like I am lucky to have missed that era. But at that point, anything that you would point out about, Russia potentially being involved in this made you pro-CIA and pro-NSA, so forth, and pro-DNC. If anything you said to the contrary, and then you're pro-Trump, Russian agent. And this is something that, again, this is something that happens organically. It's probably the natural result of Twitter, of a number of just unfortunate dynamics in American life, to some extent that we still don't know everything about. It was definitely encouraged. It was definitely used in order to make it, fairly certain that you could get away with really extraordinary election interference operations and get caught, and even have New Yorker and New York Times report on it, and it just wouldn't matter. I mean, so yeah, so there was at that period, and I think up until recently, I think things are changing to some extent, at least on that front. Obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine sort of reignited this difficulty in going after the FBI, the CIA, which once again are able to sort of harness that situation, portray themselves as the defenders of the U.S. and the exact opposite of the Russian disinformation state. Those doctrines do make it impossible, like absolutely impossible, to do any real journalism on anything touching upon those issues, which most important things do.
It's strange, isn't it? It's possibly a symptom of the social media immediacy age, but basically people don't seem to be able to cope with complex narratives or nuance where there might be more than one bad actor in a situation, or with potentially different agendas and such like that.
It's very similar to the 1930s, particularly in the UK, wherein Stalinists and some intellectuals among the upper crust, went full Stalinist. The others went full Catholic, reactionary.
Yeah.
And it's what Orwell complained about quite a bit in his essays and articles, even prior to the war. When he sort of crystallized these issues. It was the key elements of British and U.S. Intellectual life. This inability to decide that, yes, maybe if we're all leftists and Fabians, whatever, the Soviet Union is going to be our best chance. But also maybe if it fucks up, then maybe that will damage our cause forever, which it did. And so perhaps we shouldn't shill for Stalin and pretend that, or pretend that, whatever. And again, so it's the same old story. It's very much what happened. The DNC, WikiLeaks, everything I've been party to, but been privy to the workings of, has fallen to the same exact dynamic where we are in the right, and thus everything is permissible, nothing is true. And gee, I sure hope we don't destroy it ourselves. Every movement destroys itself. They're vulnerable within themselves.
Absolutely. One person that sort of vaguely got mentioned that I believe you've actually interviewed in the past, Alex Jones. Have you heard the potential connection between him and Stratfor, in as much as essentially InfoWars started about the same time as Stratfor in the same place? There's some staffing members that seem to be going backwards and forth. He now is hiring Blackwater mercenaries to basically be his private security and to monitor his wife, who appears to be having an affair. And he's constantly having was in the past, having Alexander Dugin and a lot of pro-Russian stuff on his show. I
do remember someone mentioning that possible connection a couple of years ago. It's one of the things that I would have, if I had more bandwidth, I would definitely have looked into. On the other hand, again, I'm not sure what positive will come of it, since we can't really get our messages out effectively. But so Alex Jones, so it would make sense if he were in some way, with whatever arrangements, with whatever party, whatever each party thought of the situation, and if one was conning the other, or if they're both on the same page, whatever, that would be a plausible scenario. I don't know of any evidence of it myself, but I haven't looked into it, so I can't say anything about it. He has always puzzled me, because back in the early 21st century, when he got his start on cable access in Austin, Texas, where I was living at the time, he seemed sincere. He seemed like a somewhat intelligent kind of basic bitch right-wing person who had, for whatever reason, come across, various legitimate issues involving the intelligence community and powerful families, Bush family, so forth, and went overboard and was kind of excitable and also maybe hated Mexicans. Like, that's the impression he gave off. And I did interview him for 2002 for some minor magazine. And so I had the opportunity to meet him. I met him with a friend of mine, a Lebanese woman. And when I went off to go to the store real quick, and he started telling her about the Jews and stuff, and which is odd, because even at that time, Alex Jones purported to believe that the government was trying to shut him down, was trying to discredit him. The intelligence community would. So you would think, if you were that, if you wanted that real impression, if that was really your genuine belief, that you would be disinclined to start spouting your anti-Semitic theories to attractive women that look out of a James Bond movie, when some journalists you've never met before, and you don't trust the media, understandably, it doesn't seem in character. Having said that, people do silly things. So, but it just, the main thing to know about him, I guess, is that, back in early 21st century, he was very vocal about Rudy Giuliani being involved in 9/11. By the time I got out of prison, he was having Rudy Giuliani on. So I don't know if he forgave him, decided that, maybe that, New York needed to be blown up anyway, or maybe he changed his mind or didn't believe it to begin with, or whatever. It just, we can, the hypothesis of he's a sincere guy who really believes this, we can dispose of that now. And the question becomes, what is his deal? Why is he building his entire doctrine community around the idea of these individuals engaging in 9/11 as an inside job, and then hanging out with them and promoting them? What can we make of that? That's the kind of thing I would love to see him asked, but he's been busy, with these other court sessions about the school shooting thing. So, but yeah, it's one of those astounding things that I think the answer is probably very murky, and it probably involves a lot of things with Roger Stone and Michael Flynn. And how do you get involved with that? And I've dealt with both those individuals, Roger Stone in particular, in person. And there is, I do very much what these intelligence assets do. I just do it in the other direction in some cases, and I don't like to talk about it. So I do engage with very terrible people in order to see what they have. But when you deal with these people, you're dealing with really crazy Nixon era kind of tactics. And again, those of us who are sort of fresh faced, just fell off the turn-up truck, kind of come from a perhaps background in which we assume everyone else is being honest as well, and with everyone's very, it's very hard to contend with. So I can't make anything of it, and I'm not sure I would want to meet someone who could. I feel like a degree of dishonesty or bad character to really follow these through. So it's one when they feel more identified, when we know that they're this person. Ideally, I think they should be stopped at that point, rather than we just kind of like, hey, it's a terrible person. Let's watch what they do for the next 10 years. Simply because they're very hard, they're very squishy. You can't really get around them. They're very good at these dynamics, and they've done much more damage to our civilization and to other civilizations around the world. And we don't really take that seriously as a society, because we don't really, as a society, really care that much what the consequences are. That's the other, I guess, problem we're up against. Again, ideally, Peter Thiel, Roger Stone, Alex Jones, all these people, insofar as they're discovered to have engaged in these conspiracies against the public, and then do it again and again, and they keep buying off editors. Ideally, that's the point at which we start discussing what our options are, to the extent that we take responsibility for civilization. In reality, it's more like a Weimar Germany kind of thing, 1932, or France in 1940, with the Third Republic just not really worrying about the Germans, not really seeing the value in tanks or airplanes or Jews. It's that kind of situation where we're not prepared to deal with what's coming, and we're going to sort of allow it, and it's going to be unfortunate for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, the answer could be that Alex Jones is John Birch, essentially. So it's that entire thing. His politics overtly changed on screen just about the time that he had a pretty expensive divorce. And also at the same time, it later came out, I forget exactly where this came out, but he was actually financed by, he was considered part of the Trump campaign. Were you aware of QAnon and Pizzagate? Did they ever sort of get on your radar?
So I was still in a halfway house in Dallas without access to computers or phones at that point. So I caught the snippets of it. Obviously, since then, QAnon has continued to be a factor. So I've had the chance to to hear from some people who investigated on different capacities. And it's a difficult thing to really, it's an easy thing for grifters to kind of say like, oh, I'm investigating Pizzagate, or QAnon.
Yeah.
And here's the answer to it. It's one of those things a lot of people have made a lot of money and got a lot of traction doing. I think it's a very difficult thing to, aside from broad assessments we can make, like Michael Flynn is almost certainly involved in some way. There seem to be a lot of either perhaps intentional red herrings around it.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah.
So it's like they can end up wasting your time essentially with nothing to show for it. As a consequence, I have not followed it as closely as a lot of other people. So I actually know less about it than any reasonably honest, competent reporter, so forth.
It's all nonsense. We've described it in the past as like politics for people that like wrestling.
Yeah.
It was to get people that weren't engaged with politics in any way.
Sure.
Interestingly, the McMahons, Vince McMahon was part of the Trump campaign as well. So they had that. Yeah, no, seriously. In fact, a friend of mine who was very into wrestling, when Trump first came on the scene, when he's doing Stone Cold Steve Austin. He's literally doing Stone Cold Steve Austin. Whether that is accurate or not, I don't know. This guy is very well into that and stuff. So, but it's fascinating that, it's about appealing to people, isn't it?
Absolutely. And successful intelligence operatives, information operatives, they draw from established, successful scams, media, art, they pick and choose from things that have been tested over time for thousands of years, from cold reading to whatever. And they put together a chimera made up of parts of those things. And they're obviously very successful for obvious reasons. So that's what we're up against.
Well, that's why it's important that there are people like yourself who are prepared to sort of like sift and wade through the disinformation. Barrett, I've noticed that we've had you for an hour, and I'm very conscious that your time is precious. Are you all right to just answer a few more questions about your book?
Absolutely. Now, my time was precious years ago when I had a real access to the press. Right now, there's no point. It doesn't matter.
Brent had a question about 4chan, actually, just before we dive into your book, if that's all right.
That is all right.
Well, just about 4chan culture back in the day and its dalliance with conspiracism and conspiracy theories. And I see like back in the day, it was more as a joke. And now obviously QAnon has kind of took over 4chan and 8chan and it doesn't seem like it's a joke anymore.
Sure.
You mentioned twice when you got out of prison, you realized like everything had changed. You know, people had lost their minds or these conspiracies were going around. So like you saw the culture shift and change or the way it used to be and the way it is now. Like, how do you just feel about that whole situation?
The initial culture of 4chan and its sort of adjacent venues back in between 2006 and 2010 was not at all interested in or prone to those kinds of conspiracies without evidence. It was a very cynical, very jokey. It was above that. Whatever individual political inclinations or whatever vulnerabilities individuals might have had that they might would have believed, that was not a venue in which you expressed those things or anything that was serious. It was not that kind of forum. In the activist phase, 2010, 2011, the operations, the actual things that were reported on that mattered, like sometimes didn't matter, but reported on anyway, all of that had shifted away from 4chan itself to several IRC servers that had been created in the course of the Church of Scientology campaign. As such, the culture was, in some parts, had a portion of it had the DNA had come from 4chan, but increasingly, as of people like me, who, like again, I did read 4chan back in the day. You know, a lot of my friends say, "Well, it was quite a funny thing," but it gradually took on this other ingredient of people who didn't come from 4chan, didn't come from B, were not necessarily comfortable with that culture. And really, no decent person is to the extent you see the extent of that culture. I mean, there was lots of fun, again, lighthearted stuff. It also attracted people who are just disturbing, people with seriously disturbing mental issues, who are, many of whom were gradually recruited as FBI assets, and some of whom are very successful and remain today. Weave was one of them. There are a number of others involved in putting out disinformation about activists who were being prosecuted, including myself. So when I got out, it was like a guy for the Atlantic, a reporter for the Atlantic, was interviewing me. He was having to explain to me, what was going on at 4chan. And he gave me a sense. I got a sense, this right-wing variant had come out. It had become weaponized, and it had a lot more structural establishment support than we did, which is understandable. That's always the case. The left wing, it's like Hegel. 4chan is like Hegel. I wrote that in the book. It gave birth to a left-wing variant, a right-wing variant. Both were inherently nonsense. Both draw from the same stream. And as with things from the 20s, from about 1920 onwards in the West, wherein, of course, the U.S. and Britain and all that were all very quick to go after the Bolsheviks and the Russia, the left-wing variant, or supposedly left-wing variant, for this, by the same nature. Churchill and all them were fond of Mussolini, and the right-wing variant seems to them like their kind of people, initially at least. Same thing with most fascist movements, and same thing in most modern nations. Right-wing groups can coalesce with the police. They tend to have institutional support because they do respect certain institutions, and a lot of those institutions are frequented by the same kind of people. Hence the intersection between police and white supremacist groups. Just a couple of days ago, black woman in the U.S. was shot, unjustified, by a white police officer with a Viking calendar tattoo on his arm. We call it race warriors. It's a big thing. So this Atlantic reporter explains to me, and that's the metaphor I came up with then. It said it's very much like the 1930s. We have a Hegelian left, Hegelian right, or it's like the central steps, giving voice to different waves of barbarian horsemen who then come and wreak havoc among the settled cities and so forth, whether it be the establishment. I happen to have liked the horde of barbarians that I was with because I had a degree of control over it to some extent. We were able to focus on actual criminals of the worst sort. We were able to achieve some success, not as much as perhaps we could have. And so obviously it was so the conspiracy element of 4chan with the slash poll thing, where a lot of the QAnon stuff was incubated, that was not a thing in any respect back in my day before I went off to prison. It is definitely, I mean, almost certainly. I've forgotten some of the details of what I've been shown in the last few years regarding that, but in general, yes, there was definitely some manipulation there. There's definitely, I mean, obviously, everyone from the Marine Corps to all these private companies to Russian intelligence, they're all aware of the potential energy invested in these online groups that have an identity and so forth. Obviously, they were very aware of Anonymous's powers, strength, because they had to go up against it. Sometimes they exaggerated our powers, like the NSA head who said we would be taking down nuclear power plants in a few years. Again, he was just trying to get more funding. So 4chan, just like Casablanca back in the day, is a place in which different elements, different factions from around the world have been fighting high stakes battles to achieve control of the zeitgeist, as it will, to achieve control of things that have some brand power and so forth, to subvert them for different ends. And so Anonymous, even when I was with it, was already being pushed in different directions. Those of us who were prominent within it were oftentimes unaware of how we were being used or pushed in directions by some of these forces. Again, we came out of, even I, who had a journalism background and come from Dallas, Texas, which is a historical centerpiece of the U.S. intelligence and military community, was very naive about our ability to navigate that. And it wasn't until, much later, having to go through all these things, having spoken to other individuals in the intelligence community and so forth, do you get a sense of what was actually occurring and what the consequences were. So it's not surprising in retrospect. I mean, if I had known all this in 2012, or any observer did, you could have predicted that, yes, this will be used by elements of the U.S. military intelligence community, the far right-wing faction of the FBI and so forth, and these other individual billionaire actors. They will use this as a petri dish to create something that they can work with. And they did successfully.
Do you think Gamergate was part of that? Or do you think that was actually just organic, people just getting on their feelings? Or?
I couldn't confidently assess, but I would say, just based on what I think I know about it, at least from what I've seen, I think that was organic. It's at any rate, there's no reason why it shouldn't be organic, given that what it seems to be is a weirdo careerist journalist being assailed by a bunch of anti-female, scumbag, it was just scumbag central across the board. So that seems to me a pretty by the numbers sort of establishment person get caught doing basic establishment stuff. That person happens to be a woman in the gaming industry, which is we don't have to wonder if there are organic, just mass amounts of just Morlock level behavior within that community. I do think it was organic for that matter. Having said that, I do know that some individuals that were involved in that did later emerge in more serious capacities. But I think that's because those things are a great recruiting ground.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing with many of these conspiracy theories or conspiracy communities. I do believe they start off organically. Same with Pizzagate and QAnon, but they do end up getting used or gamed by people who can manipulate us. And that's something that I saw myself, how I came out of the conspiracy world. So I fell in 2003, looking up conspiracy documentaries about 9/11, basically on DC++. And I started looking at that sort of stuff and going into secret societies and watching Alex Jones and David Icke and these sorts of people. But let's fast forward to 2015, and I started seeing these political people kind of using our shit, and using it against us to politicize us and get us on their side, when I kind of always remember there being no sides. The left wing and the right wing were the same bird. That's what Alex Jones had been saying for 2 decades. And now all of a sudden he's got Trump on InfoWars and he's got Nigel Farage on InfoWars. And, I could just see how it became weaponized by this other group of people. It kind of made me start thinking, maybe this is all bullshit then. Maybe it's actually not even true.
When I was a young fellow, grew up in Dallas, a friend of mine had a really douchey older brother who was into punk rock and very into the punk rock aesthetic and putting on airs of being a streetwise, downtrodden person. And they were, I mean, his mom was a high-class prostitute, so they were kind of, they were down the scale, so that didn't look the aesthetic. But he was a douchebag regardless, this older brother of his. And he was very into the Beach Boys. And he would sometimes pick us up from the movie theater at his mom's request, and he'd be playing the Beach Boys, ironically, kind of, because that was the kind of thing like punks like, oh, the Beach Boys, they would be appreciated on a really weird, obnoxious level. And as a result, my friend, who is now a journalist in Austin, he hated the Beach Boys. That had been his exposure to the Beach Boys, this older brother of his. He just associated with douchebagginess. And I explained to him, you know what, the Beach Boys, they don't deserve this. They had nothing to do with your brother. And I get it. I get you've been exposed to it. You associate with that. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Leave the Beach Boys alone. Now, there are other reasons to not like the Beach Boys. One of his friends was, one of the participants was big friends with Charles Manson. But it's not, that's not the right reason. It's not because of his older brother, Cody, who was a douchebag. And so I say that because there's a very similar dynamic that occurs with ideas, associations, certain arguments even. And this is something that's been very pronounced, especially, again, since I got out of prison in 2016. It's like it seems to have sort of really metastasized, if that's how you pronounce the word, between 2012 and 2016. This as predilection for associating a fraudulent actor or a bad actor or whatever, or even just an argument or a piece of evidence that may give aid and comfort to the enemy with these other packaged, larger villains or so forth. And that, again, that's something that we have to do. I mean, if someone comes up to you and says, hey, I'm really critical of George Soros, you're right to expect that he's uninformed and he's heard some nonsense. In a few cases, though, what he's going to say next isn't going to be like he's a Jew who runs the world. Son of say, well, I don't like the fact that he's involved in these kind of financial deals. He made a lot of his money do it. Again, he's probably not going to say that, but the poor son of a bitch who is going to approach it that way, who has a legitimate, well thought out, well intended argument that he wants to put out that he thinks is important, he becomes a victim of this drive-by of obscurantism, this drive-by, this sort of shrapnel bomb of culture war, of sort of Twitter-based, they're saying that about Hillary Clinton, they're Trump or Russia and all that, or they're saying this about, And so in the case of any conspiracy theory or any hypothesis about something that may have happened, whether it be Russian intelligence, the FSB, false flag attacks, stuff Nixon did, trying to give LSD to Anderson, the reporter. It's very important, regardless of what Alex Jones's role is, regardless of what David Icke's role is, and regardless of what improvisational tactics may have been used by private contractors, intelligence communities to use them as a means of ensuring there's no real scrutiny on certain things they don't want scrutiny on. We have to try to keep in check our heuristics whereby we associate certain things with certain people. And that's hard to do because again, nine times out of 10, it makes sense to think the guy with the Confederacy t-shirt walking by is a Confederate. The other 10, he's a hipster, or he's doing a funny movie, he's doing a skit for his local, trying to make YouTube videos, it's that kind of thing. And unfortunately, that's the kind of dynamic that makes it much more difficult. People who do very specific, nuanced kinds of journalism, it makes it hard for us to be candid about some of the things that we come across and so forth. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of the things I think that are really important and that the public will benefit from, and that are also sort of agreed upon by the surprising number of pretty straight-laced mainstream journalists, don't tend to get the light of day. It's one of the reasons why Saudi Arabia got away with its heavy involvement in 9/11, because the idea was that if you question the 9/11 Commission, it's because you believe the Twin Towers were destroyed by a laser from Moloch that Bohemian Grove shot out for some numerology reason, and not because all of the evidence. I mean, even Keane, the guy that the commissioner of 9/11 Commission, the guy who ran it after the report came out, people should read what he had to say about it. He was, like me, he was a hollow shell at the end of it. He was upset, and he publicly denounced it. And he was right, because years later we learned more about the Saudi Arabians and what we knew, what the Bush family knew and all that. And it's not surprising given they go back and George Bush Sr. was a weirdo.
Kind of goes to what you were saying in your book, where you were mentioning in your conspiracy chapter about the Bilderberg group or Bohemian Grove. There are conspiracies there, like the lobbying.
Yeah.
We've said it many times on our show because we did a show about the World Economic Forum, Bohemian Grove.
Nixon gave his favorite speech. Nixon gave Bohemian Grove.
Yeah, exactly. So there are like proper conspiracies there, but it doesn't seem like they're sexy enough for people like Alex Jones, or even like what I was into. I was into some really deep shit. Like I always say it was like proto-Q, because I really followed William Cooper and David Icke. So I kind of like believed in this satanic pedophile elite, like secret society that was running the world, and being able to strip that away and see what the actual kind of conspiracies really are, like the people being corrupt, covering shit up, which also, again, another brilliant point that you bring up in the book is your experience with journalism and the press room kind of rips apart any idea of there being a grand overarching conspiracy.
Yeah, there. What we have is a lot of the kind of things you can see from Thiel and Elon Musk. We can see little pieces of the iceberg come up. We can see that there are grandiose visions still. This is the 21st century. Out of the 20th century, people are sort of smaller now, so we have less big, crazy, monstrous, perhaps dangerous, sometimes wonderful plots going on. We don't have the round tables anymore. We don't have the Anglo-American alliance where they're trying to bring us back together and keep the Germans out. We don't have the German. We don't have the Nazis. We don't have esoteric, Nazism. We don't have Blavatsky. We don't have all these eccentric but sometimes effective individuals. And to the extent we do, they're much lower profile, and I don't think it's a sort of a sector of people can kind of kid themselves a lot. You're gonna come across lots of wealthy people, as I have, who are convinced themselves that they are involved in the Illuminati. You'll also find, like when I used to go smoke crack in downtown Dallas before I went to prison the first time, you'll meet people without any money at all, black kids, who say like, "Oh, I'm part of the Illuminati," because some rappers are. So again, it's difficult to determine. Really, it's different. Like which of these are just sort of they're enthusiasts, they're hobbyists. Which of them actually do have a degree of power because they went to Yale with what's his name and what's his name Jr. and blah blah. And they also have these sort of weird Anglo-Saxon kind of Eastern establishment traditions that they're really big into, like the Bush family does. And it's hard. It can be very easy to look at that and say, "Oh, this is supposed to be a monolithic, effective thing." Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's only capable, as with the Bush family, of directing U.S. foreign policy towards towards the benefit of the Saudi royal family, which is what the Bush family accomplished several times for about 20 years without much for the press. That's a lot. That's still a lot. It's still a lot to sort of redirect U.S. military policy in really bizarre ways that don't make any sense to serve Kuwait and to serve Saudi Arabia while you're have financial entanglements with the Saudi Arabian family and you come from the CIA like Bush did. That's quite a bit. And that's enough right there. So we don't really need to go look beyond that for anything more exotic than that. It's pretty straightforward. The things that Lyndon Johnson tended to do for Kellogg, Brown, and Root, pretty straightforward. They're monstrous. And in some cases, these individuals, not Johnson, who was kind of a sociopath, but others, they will articulate to you convincingly, if you happen to talk to them privately, they'll say, "Here's why I have to do this. This is why I'm doing this, because the real world is like this. I have not just the right, but the duty to engage in this seemingly monstrous crime to achieve this greater good." That's essentially what the Democratic National Convention has been for quite a while. It's been quite understandable because you're up against the Republicans. It's very easy to say, "No, I've got to go talk on Wall Street with this guy. I've got to hang out with Epstein, take his money, blah, blah. Oops, now I'm kind of tied to that. That's going to look bad. Luckily, so is the Republicans, blah, blah." It's a self-defeating, but very real and it's a phenomenon that needs more study from real people, from real researchers, rather than the fanatics and enthusiasts who entered into this vacuum. Again, so if young people saw, like on CNN, like a documentary on Sundays, for instance, or read in BuzzFeed or Daily Beast, which they never will, some articles about these things that they can't help but come across and realize are valid. If they're able to get it from that, they won't have to go find Andrew Tate and the 50 other just subhuman Nazi associates who have insensibly taken over much of our society in the last 15 years while I was off in prison. And so to the extent that we are able to fulfill that role, it's just like parents who talk to their kids about drugs or sex, so they won't hear about it on the schoolyard from Alex Jones or Andrew Tate, who's just going to sex traffic your kids anyway. We have to be good parents in that same sense to the public and be like, yes, the things that you're interested in, they are things you should be interested in. You're right to be curious about this, and you're right to sense that you're not getting a very, very helpful version of this in the main press, either because they're incompetent or because they're afraid of looking silly and there's peer pressure or whatever reason. And you're right to ask us about this. Here's what we know about it. Keep an open mind. Explore for yourself. People get wrong. That's how we need to be. And by we, if by we I mean the mainstream press, from The Economist on down, it will never happen. You go look at the 90s. You go look at like Siskel and Ebert. They reviewed a documentary about Waco. Back then in the 90s, although issues regarding Waco and the Branch Davidians and the FBI, they were already associated to some extent with the far right. Understandably, it was not yet considered outre. It was not considered out of line or inherently crazy to look into what happened and castigate the FBI. So if you go on YouTube and look up Siskel and Ebert's review of this Waco documentary, it is night and day. It is vastly different than the tone we have today, where a lot of the center left and all that thinks that that it's their duty to just dismiss things as conspiracy theories because there's a vague association with the far right. Unfortunately, that's happened with the deaths of Val Broeksmit, Michael Hastings, Kevin Gallagher, other people, Darren Schwartz, other colleagues of mine who have died. And then they all tend to die on our side. That's happened quite a bit, where they die and then perhaps someone on a forum somewhere says the Clintons killed them, and then a person from Vice or BuzzFeed writes an article, oh, there's conspiracy theories about the Shirley's. They don't look into what they were investigating beforehand. They tend not to look into the recordings they put out of their meetings with the FBI. Nothing is looked into openly. These things revert to those of us who kind of do these things quietly among ourselves. And as such, this is part of a larger problem where there's going to be less public opportunity to know, to be privy to the things that some of us are privy to, because we can't trust the average Twitter user, the average commenter, the average journalist, the average editor to give us the benefit of the doubt and look into the things. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have, as this sort of civil war environment heats up, which it will, and it is, the conflicts that will sort of occur between fascism and anti-fascism will be covert. It'll be another sort of CIA situation where we don't, just like the CIA, we don't trust the public. We see the public as a threat and the enemy correctly. And we just carry out what we do on the slide. That is not what I set out. It's not the situation I was looking forward to when I got involved in the transparency community 15 years, but it is the only way forward. Yeah, that's really kind of the main sort of argument or just idea that I want to kind of put across, is that the more one becomes an expert and acquires documentation and materials and can even present these materials and answer questions to anyone's satisfaction on certain subjects, the more one becomes vulnerable to the fact that a lot of these subjects have certain associations that are hard to shake. And the more one becomes vulnerable to being dismissed, prosecuted, and sort of losing sort of the ability to put out these ideas to begin with. That's what I've seen happen.
That's spot on as well, because the sort of the movement away by the left, away from conspiratorial thinking or holding truth to power, holding institutions to judgment, whatever, it really left a vacuum that the far right basically went, well, we will nurture you. We're not going to reject you. In fact, furthermore, have you seen this thing, this even more extreme thing, basically? And it's it's frightening the way that's how that dynamic works, really.
Yeah, and it has a knock-on effect of the FBI and DNC then become allies, because as a consequence of far right conspiracy theories, that then see the FBI is the ones who are going to eventually arrest these people when they shoot, when they go and rush the Capitol.
Yeah,
when the FBI turns out to have again elements of the FBI being far right supporting these things, it makes it harder. It makes it harder for us to out far right FBI assets, far right FBI agents, when the FBI is being seen as the one, the messiah that's going to come and defeat Trump.
And you've got two sides of the same coin. You've got the soft authoritarianism on the left, being the sort of like trusting institutions, and you've got the hard authoritarianism on the right, which is basically we want to tear these institutions down and replace them with something else, basically. So, yeah, frightening. Barrett, I'm very, very conscious that we've had you for about an hour and a half. I could honestly, mate, I could talk to you all week. I'm such a fan of everything that you've done. Would it be possible to get you back on again in the future at some point?
Absolutely. Yep.
Because we've barely touched on anything to do with anonymous and stuff like that.
No, yeah, absolutely. This is my favorite. This is my pet subject as well. These general things. So I'd love to come back on and go into some of these peripheral issues. And really drill down on them, because there's a lot of very interesting, I think, useful elements that I can put forward that are sort of concrete and perhaps might better illustrate some of these things than kind of the harangues that I've been giving you thus far. So I'd love to come back in.
That'd be marvelous. Would you like to just plug your book?
Yeah, I got a book. You can buy. I've already been paid for it. I don't care.
Fair play.
I won't get any more money for it beyond what I've already gotten. It comes out of the royalties. It's not going to do that well for the reasons I've explained.
Well, he should.
Yeah, I mean, if people want, you should just look up my name and look up Barrett Brown, Val Brokesmith, Barrett Brown, Michael Hastings. Look at some of the articles written. Look at the New York Times review of my book. That's actually unusually cogent in terms of the themes. And the best thing people can do is just study a couple of these issues, study kind of what we've put out on the FBI infiltration of the left-wing spaces, the identity extremist community among the blacks, which the FBI is obsessed with. Kind of see what they've been doing and decide for yourself how far we are down that line, and I guess to speak for yourself, what is the red line at which point we have a duty to be more aggressive in our civic disobedience? That's the main thing people can do. The book is peripheral.
Fantastic. Yeah, brilliant. That's amazing. Thank you so much, Barrett. It's been incredible.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Enjoyed the talk.